Mr. Mulvaney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we have a legal conversation, I hope we get a chance to do that. I just want to ask maybe a commonsensical question or a gut question. And I've heard Mr. Cochran's story for the first time. It's very compelling. To summarize, what I understand happened is that you were dismissed from your job even though you didn't discriminate against anybody because in a book you quoted lines out of Scripture. Is that fair, sir?
That's correct, sir.
Does anybody think that's right? Anybody in the panel? Nope. Everybody's saying no. Okay. I understand the criticisms today of the bill. In fact, one of the questions I'm going to ask Mr. Lee is why he wrote it the way that he did, because I think you're right. I think the bill as written would not protect Mr. Cochran. But if we all agree that what happened to Mr. Cochran is wrong, and I happen to agree with that, and apparently everybody else does here. In fact, I'd ask everybody here if they think that was right. How do we fix that? And well, Mr. Frank, you know I'm going to give you a chance to talk because you and I are friends, and I'm going to do it. But I want to, before we move on, I want to ask a couple other questions, and then we figure out how to fix this, because that is something that needs to be fixed. The next question is this: if there is a Jewish school that happens to teach traditional marriage, is there anybody here who thinks they should lose their tax-exempt status? No one's saying yes. I assume everybody says no. Someone in the back says yes. We'll talk to them later.
It depends.
And I'm going to come to that in a second. And I'll ask the same questions about Catholic churches. Should they lose their tax-exempt status if they won't marry gay couples? I think the answer is no. Does anyone want to take the position that they should?
None ever have.
Oh, none ever have, and I want to get to that. And lastly, I can ask the same thing about, pick a list, Islamic charities that choose not to serve homosexual couples. I don't think anybody would take the position here that any of those entities should lose their tax-exempt status. Mr. Frank, I'll start with you, because I know you're interested in doing this. But
they shouldn't lose their tax-exempt status, but neither should they be eligible for a federal grant as they would be under this bill. And among the religions...
Yeah, but you don't get to have it both ways. And what you said before was that you didn't want to have your tax money used to do things that you can't participate in.
Right.
There are a lot of people who think that the fact that the Catholic Church receives tax-exempt status, one of them is sitting in this room, that's using their tax money, but you are not allowed to avail yourself of that.
No, well, one, frankly, I've been told that the church is interested in conversions, and my understanding is that I'd probably be welcome. But the second point is this, and not only would I be welcome, the Pope wouldn't judge me. But the other point, though, is this. I do draw a distinction. I hope you're not, Representative Mulvaney, equating a tax exemption with a federal grant. I think a tax exemption, that there's a lower level of scrutiny that applies for a tax exemption than to getting a federal grant. And that's the distinction I would make. Unless you're equating the two, and you're saying that anybody eligible for an exemption should be eligible for a grant.
And what I'm saying to you, Mr. Frank, is that I think there are people who disagree with me, by the way, who might be of a different mindset on this, who don't differentiate between the two.
Well, look, there are people who think Elvis is alive, but I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's the way the government works. None of us act on that basis.
But to Mr. Lee's point, again, I'm sorry that he left us. I think Mr. Cummings is right. I would have liked to have them stay, but I didn't get a chance to ask him this. He pointed to an exchange during Mr. Oberfeld's campaign, during the case in front of the Supreme Court, where it seems as if that question is very much open.
And if you wanted
there are certain things this administration have said that said they're open-minded to withdrawing the tax exemption.
I understand that.
So go ahead.
Divide it up. There's tax exemption. There's a question of firing. By the way, I don't think the fire chief should have been fired, but neither do I think that the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission shouldn't be able to inquire into abuse. And my difference with my former colleague, Mr. Jordan, is this. This is not a bill to protect First Amendment rights. That Atlanta City Councilor, every other First Amendment right except this one would be checked. So how do you protect them? You pass a bill that says no one can be fired because of his or her political or religious opinion that is wholly irrelevant to the job. And you don't single out one particular aspect of one particular religion. Separately, you deal with tax exemption separately. But we've always held a different view. Richard Nixon started this when he said, you're going to not get a federal contract if you don't engage in even affirmative action in the construction area. But you could have your tax exemption, but you couldn't get the federal grant. So I think there are three levels. There's whether or not you can speak out. There's tax exemption. Yes, you should be protected in your expression of opinion, religious or not, as long as it's irrelevant to your job.
when there is a lawsuit brought to deny the Jewish school, the Catholic Church, or the Islamic charity their tax-exempt status, I hope they play that. Now, Ms. Frank, by the way, does anybody else think
The
it's...
gentleman's time has
Oh.
expired.
sorry.
Last question, we've been a little generous, and so last
No,
question, very quickly.
I
Mr.
couldn't
Chairman,
do-
if I was here, I'd yield time, because I used up his time.
I couldn't do it in just a couple of
You've used up a lot of people's time, but that's all right.
It's not the first time that Mr. Frank has taken my time at one of these hearings, but I always enjoy the back and forth. Thank you all for participating. Ms. Frank, I did want you to follow up. Maybe somebody else gave you a chance to do it when you said that under certain circumstances, you might want to deprive those religious institutions of their tax-exempt status. Maybe you'll get a chance to follow through on that with somebody else. So I thank the chairman. I thank the panel.
All right, I thank the gentleman. I'm going to recognize one other. There's actually